This is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And oh, wow, do I have a story for you today because I have a very, very special guest, Beau L'Amour. He's an author and the son of Louis L'Amour. What more do I have to say? Because that is like perfection, absolute perfection. And I'm so happy to welcome you to the program, Beau. Wow, this is exciting. How are you?
I am doing well.
Okay, well, I got you up early there in California, and so we could do this. And it's so exciting for me. As I mentioned to you, I've been a fan of your dad's work since I was a little girl because I lived in northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, and we had a fishing camp by the lake, and always filled, people always coming to fish year round, especially in the winter, ice fishing. And all the guys would have your dad's books. There's always a pile up in the corner, and that's what the guys would read. And I started reading at a very young age. I was reading, by the time I was 5, I was reading Perry Mason paperback books. Those were my mom's. For the guys, it was always your dad's books and the westerns, really. So I started early on reading your dad's books, and I love them. They always stayed with me. So now, where do we start with your dad? Let's start with how many books did he write?
Um, Dad wrote 92 novels, I believe. I think that No Travel Returns, there are two that weren't published during his lifetime. And so No Traveler Returns was one of them. And the other one I'm working on right now and hopefully will be done with fairly soon.
Well, here's the one, No Traveler's Return. And that's the one we're going to be talking about today because if we started talking about every one of your dad's books, we would be here for days and days and days. But I thought this one was so intriguing. When I discovered it, well, it is such a fun book to read and part of a really telling so much about him in this book. So
Yes.
let's explain. I want to show one picture of, I think this one is of you. Let's see, where do I have that picture? I have a photo of you. And
Oh, yeah.
where are you there?
I am down in San Pedro, where actually a lot of the activity in No Traveler Returns occurs. And that is in the background a Liberty ship, which is not quite as old as the ships in the book No Traveler Returns, but almost. This was a World War II era freighter, and it's one of the very, very few examples of old style merchant marine freighting ships that are left in the world. So it was a great model for what I was working on, even though the ship in No Travel Returns is a tanker rather than a freighter. It's a very similar design.
Now, did you ever have the urge to take a freighter across the ocean?
No, I
No.
get I get terribly seasick, so I don't need to go there. But I was raised, on my dad's stories of his early life. So it's kind of an important distinction probably for your listeners and viewers to go into this. My dad's very, very well known for writing westerns. That was a career that he found very lucrative after World War II. However, before the war, he wrote several different types of adventure stories. So, one of them, what I kind of jokingly call Louis 1.0. Okay, so the first version of my dad's career was writing these kind of personal adventure stories, maybe along the lines of Ernest Hemingway, something of that sort. And there is this book that's in that series, and then there's also a short story collection called Yondering. They are generally pretty high quality literary works. Um, and he was never able to make any money in that particular version of his career, and eventually kind of segued into writing more kind of blood and thunder, sort of Indiana Jones style adventures and crime stories and things of that sort. But then when the war came along and he was gone for several years, and when he came back from the war, a magazine publisher that he was very close with recommended that he write westerns. The take was, and it was very accurate, that before the war, the parts of the world that my dad had visited as a young man were very exotic and very interesting, and people were fascinated by them. But after the war, those were a lot of the places where American soldiers had gone and seen their buddies die and had spent maybe too much of their lives. And so the milieu for an adventure story kind of became the West because it was comfortably at home and it was comfortably in the past, and it just didn't kind of carry the trauma of war with it. That's my take on that transition, but it's also uh, along the lines of what Leo Margulies, this particular publisher, told my dad.
So then he went into westerns, which,
And then he went into westerns.
well, and it's really, when you think about it, it's funny. For years, I didn't realize that his name was real. I mean, as a, when I was young, it was really only a few, maybe 5 years ago or something, I realized that he wasn't related to Dorothy L'Amour, and and that the name L'Amour is the real family name, slightly differently spelled.
Yes, that's correct. The family changed the spelling a number of times. So there was another Lamore family up in the North Dakota area, and to keep mail and other things from kind of crossing, my grandfather changed the name just slightly. I think he went to Lamoore rather than sometimes it had been L Moore and sometimes it had been Lamour, but without the apostrophe. And then my dad stuck the apostrophe in there. So it's kind of always been spoken the same way, but it hasn't always been spelled the same way.
Well, where was he born? North Dakota.
Jamestown, North Dakota.
North Dakota. So North Dakota, ideal place for somebody who's going to write westerns, right?
It's funny. He didn't really think. I think so. I agree with that. Um, he didn't really think so. He saw. Um, I don't know. I think in the beginning of his career, there was very much this connection between the West and the cattle business and things like this. And there definitely was cattle business around Jamestown because it was a railroad hub, but it was more of a farming area, and perhaps more, very much connected to the culture of the upper Midwest, which was not exactly what you would find as soon as you got over the border into Montana and Wyoming and things like that. Uh, it had its own distinct culture, and hopefully there are some writers out there who write about the upper Midwest and its peculiarities. But I tend to agree with that. I think my dad grew up in conditions very similar to those in the American West. He was born in 1908, so there are huge generational jumps in my family. I was born in 1961, but my grandfather, my dad's father, was born in 1868. So he was the youngest of 8 children, and I was born very late in my dad's life. And so there are these big generations. But uh, I don't know that. I'm not sure when they lived in North Dakota that they had electricity, and I'm not sure that they had electricity in a house that they were living in until the maybe the late 1930s. So he did live a life that had a lot of similarities to what you'd see in the West. He also The family was semi destitute, kind of living from one job to the next and traveling around the country like something out of the Grapes of Wrath. And during that time period, my dad met a lot of Old West characters and a lot of people who remembered that time period as older people. So he was a kid, but he was meeting and working with people in their 60s. And, because this was an era before welfare and things like that, sometimes these people were still working well into their 70s or even 80s. And so my dad and his family baled hay throughout the Pecos Valley in New Mexico in the early 20s. At that time, he met, I think, 5 people that had personally known Billy the Kid. He actually worked for the lady who inadvertently sent Billy to his death. And so he had my dad gets a lot of credit for doing research, for his books being very well researched. And I would say for the time period in which he was writing, especially the early part of his career, his stuff was very well researched. I wouldn't say that it necessarily compares to some modern writing, but the thing that really distinguishes him was the fact that he actually knew a lot of these people. And so maybe he was the last writer kind of the American frontier who was particularly personally interacting with the people who had made the 19th century West what it was.
Wow. Wow. Now, his father was born also in North Dakota?
Um, I believe his father may have been born in Canada, and so there's a Canadian side to the family that, or at least back and forth across the border. I think there were maybe a generation or two that kind of hopped the border from the United States to Canada a number of times.
And his father was a politician, but he was also like not a sheriff, but something like that.
He was a town constable for a while. He was, I wouldn't really say a politician exactly, but he had a lot of kind of minor offices, head of the local licensing committee. Um, and he had a lot of kind of civic jobs. But, people who lived in small towns back in those days, it was hard to find somebody who hadn't had some of those jobs at some time. So his primary occupation was he was a large animal veterinarian. And when the era of what they called bonanza farming, which was these enormous wheat farms and things that they had in North Dakota, as the mechanization of that changed, they used to use these giant herds of horses, and they would run their machinery with draft horses on huge treadmills and things like that. And as the 20th century became, as they moved into the 20th century, a lot of that turned into steam powered tractors and steam powered generators. And so eventually he was a guy that sold um, farm equipment. In those days was mostly steam powered, but some of it was gas powered farm equipment, and then ran the crews that would use those. So he would either sell or rent out the equipment, and sometimes he would rent out his services along with a crew of guys that would go off and do the harvests in the area.
Well, just like what happens today, sometimes North Dakota they lose their jobs and and they're on the road, and that's exactly what
Yeah,
happened. So
yeah.
the family went on the road exactly like the Grapes of Wrath. A lot of hardship along the way, but apparently your dad, managed to talk to a lot of people along the way, and so finally they settled in Oklahoma, right?
They settled in Oklahoma, and but before we get there, I'll just sort of to tie it into the book that you want to talk about. My dad went to sea for an extended period on a couple of occasions while his family was traveling around the country trying to make a living. He broke off from them a couple of times, once from Texas, the other time from California, and and spent some time in the Merchant Marine. And then after a fairly extended stay in Oregon, working in the lumber woods and on very big Weyerhaeuser sawmill in Oregon. The whole family moved to Oklahoma to a piece of property that his older brother owned. And then my dad lived there with his parents for pretty much 10 or 12 years, from 1931 or so until he was drafted in early 42.
Well, it was lucky that he wasn't drafted and put into the Merchant Marines in 42 because those guys didn't have a very long lifespan.
They didn't, although he kind of wanted to do that because he felt like he had some knowledge in that area. He was when he initially um, when he was drafted, he wanted to go into the Navy. They wouldn't take him in the Navy. He wanted to be an officer in the Navy. They wouldn't take him because he didn't have a college education. He barely had any education, and they he went into the Army. He was initially in the tank destroyers, and so he got a whole background in armored warfare. But this being very, very early in the war, the period pretty much right after Pearl Harbor, they eventually decided that older soldiers, if you weren't in a combat unit by the time you were 34, they weren't going to put you in a combat unit. And because he was 34, they transferred him out of the tank destroyers and into the transportation corps. Um, Somewhere in that transition, interestingly enough, for your background, he got a job with a whole bunch of other troops. They went up to the Upper Peninsula to test winter equipment, and I think they picked him because he was from North Dakota and supposedly he knew something about cold weather.
Oh yeah, that's
And
a good place to go.
they sent him up to the UP, and he luckily he also had taken on coaching a Army Golden Gloves boxing team, and that got him out of a lot of the camping out in the worst of the weather. He ended up spending a lot of time in Chicago and Minneapolis and places like that with the boxers. Um, but eventually he he went to Europe and spent his time basically in charge of a platoon of gas tankers that moved fuel all over Europe, supplying the tanks and airplanes,
Well,
from D-Day
I'm glad he
until the
didn't
end of the war.
I'm glad he didn't go in the Merchant Marines. Those guys, what happened to them in the North Sea? They lost so many ships. It's mind-boggling when you look at the number of ships that we lost because they targeted them. The Nazis wanted to cut off the supply, and boy, oh boy, did they! So I'm glad your dad wasn't there.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
oh, it's always funny when you talk to somebody from one of the inland states. Somebody like North Dakota. Now, for Michigan, of course, northern Michigan, we were born on the water, and Lake Superior
Right.
is sometimes like the ocean. So we can understand somebody from there wanting to go to sea, but somebody from North Dakota, you're in the middle of nowhere, and you want to go to sea. Where did he get that idea?
That was how you saw the world. I mean, there was no way to fly someplace in an airplane, and it was also a way where you could work and see the world. If you did almost anything else, you had to be a tourist. You had to have the money to afford to go where you wanted to go, and so it was the only way. So and he was looking for, it was. Uh, it's almost forgotten, but there was a depression before the depression. There was a depression that hit particularly the Midwest, particularly the Upper Midwest, very hard in the 1920s, and so a lot of the time when he went to sea, he was looking for jobs that weren't going to last just a couple of days or a couple of weeks. And if you got on the ship he caught from California, he was on that ship for months and months and months. I mean, they left California, and they made stops all the way around the world, all through Asia and the Middle East, Mediterranean, and that he finally paid off that ship in New York. And so it was a long term job and a relatively well-paying one. I mean, well-paying compared to bucking hay.
Well, that brings us to the book, No Traveler Returns. So he wrote this book, or started to write this book, and then with everything and all of life coming at him from so many directions, he put it away. And when did you realize that you had this little treasure?
He had talked about it. Uh, he talked about it many times, and I didn't. I think I read it the first time while he was still alive, but it was more just curiosity, and it was it was a pile of chapters, almost individual stories, and it wasn't completely structured like a novel. I think a lot of writers, when they start out, they tend to write. They tend to a first novel ends up being uh, a lot of separate components, and it doesn't necessarily fuse all that well together because maybe they can't quite figure out how to tie all the pieces up. And it had some of those qualities. First novels often tend to be kind of intellectual, and it had, maybe a little bit overly intellectual, and it had those kind of qualities also. And I read it just because I was very interested. I think I read it probably around the time he was preparing the first version of Yondering, which were these uh, semi-autographical short stories. That book came out in 1980, so I probably read it around then because I knew that there was a relationship between this book and those stories, although uh, I didn't realize how close it was at the time. But I knew this was all his writing from early in his career, before he started writing the pulp adventures. And then after he passed away, I thought, oh, I'm going to pull that together as a novel, and I read it a few times, and it kind of I kind of didn't quite know what I was going to do with it, and years passed, and I read it again, and I sort of went, oh, wait a minute, this thing, if you squint your eyes and you step back a ways, this is one of those books, or there were actually some movies at the time, a film called Magnolia, and a film called Oddly Lantana, an Australian movie, also with a floral title. But there are these films that are about these groups of people that whose stories are all interconnected, and you kind of discover some sort of greater truth through the interconnectedness of them. And I thought, oh, gosh, that's what this is. And it kind of works with the Yondering stories in the same way. But this book in particular um, is a story about how all these different characters are connected, but they either don't know it, or they're just discovering it, and how the ships and the uh, merchant marine in various ways connects all the different peoples and places in the world. And I said, oh boy, there were maybe, I don't know, maybe 3 to 5 connections like that in the story. And I thought, I can do more with that. I can see where there could be a couple of others, and I can see where I could play that up and tie this thing together more tightly, and make what happens to the ship more uh, a single fused element with the characters that are on the ship. So they're all affecting one another's fate. There's this wonderful little there's this wonderful thing that my dad wrote and sort of stuck in amongst the pages that I put right at the beginning of the story. Um, it says, "Fate is a ship, a steel gray, lovely bark, or a tanker westbound." And I had no idea what that meant. Maybe it was something he was thinking he was going to use in the story. I could never figure out how to use it in the story, but I kind of put it as like a little entry into how the story starts, and that really clarified a lot of stuff. And so, then I had to, luckily I have access to all my dad's writing and all of his correspondence and things like that, and I could discover what his mindset was at the time, how he thought about those times in his life later on. Um, I went and, even though it's not very far away, it's about 30 miles away. I went down and I lived in San Pedro for quite a few weeks. I had a friend who had an apartment down there that he wasn't using. And I lived down there and got to know the place. This is the kind of the home port of the ship where a lot of the stories sort of return to San Pedro, and so I kind of got to know it. And luckily, San Pedro's kind of all about its history. So there's it was fairly easy, and I just got to spend time kind of walking the streets and to learn what it actually looked like and felt like at the time. Because oddly, my dad's story takes place in the uh, later 1930s, and he had not been there for 10 years, and the city had actually changed dramatically in that time period. How it looked, everything else. I mean, an enormous amount of I just had to say this, an enormous amount of dirt had been taken out of San Pedro. Whole hills had been removed to bring in rail systems and things like this. And then it had changed again into the town that I was seeing during World War II and afterwards. And so it was kind of a trick to figure out exactly what it was like in the time period that he was writing about.
Well, I think you did a great job putting it together because
Thank
it
you.
so nicely. It is so interesting. And of course, when you think about it and you think this is a beginning of his enormous career, the mind is sort of boggled when you think about the number of books that he sold. Do you know the number?
Okay, so we are relatively certain that the number is a fair amount higher than 320 million copies sold. But I have to say that because the press loves numbers, publishers love numbers, and they do a certain amount of just making them up. So, in the early days of my dad's career, especially in the time period when he wasn't just exclusively at Bantam, which is now Random House. Um, he had three or four publishers for a while, and so the number of books that they sold in those days uh, is almost unknown. It's kind of estimated, but pretty much unknown. Also, the way the paperback book business worked was that they printed enormous quantities of books. They shipped them out to the various bookstores and newsstands, and anything that wasn't sold, the bookstore or newsstand ripped the cover off, threw the book in the trash, and mailed the covers back to the publisher for a refund. So the book business is a 100% return business. If you're a bookstore and a publisher ships you books and you don't sell them, you can send them back pretty much at any time and get a full refund. And it's one of the things that the stores and the publishers have done to make sure that beginning authors that don't have a great track record, actually get well represented, because the bookstore is not taking any real risk on a beginning author. So it's a very good thing, and it's been like this for quite a while. But what happens is, in the early days of the paperback book business, uh, let me just kind of back up and give you a little book business history, because it's kind of interesting. Um, Before World War II, you had hardcover books and pulp magazines. And the hardcovers, there were maybe 500 bookstores in the whole country. The majority of them were in New England. Um, if you sold your book to a hardcover publisher, a good sale was 5,000 copies. So it was compared to something today, it was incredibly low. And the book business just kind of idled along with that sort of model. it pretty much ignored the fact that the pulp magazines were selling thousands and thousands and thousands of copies of, magazines full of short stories. And the book business paid almost no attention to that. After World War II, because of some things that happened during the war, because of certain publishing uh, attempts during the war, and because of publishing trends coming in from England, the paperback book business started. And the hardcover publishers pretty much had contempt for it. They just thought, this is nothing, this is unimportant. Maybe we get a secondary sale if we sell our titles on to our hardcover titles on to paperback, but they kind of thought it was a fad and they thought it wouldn't matter. The paperback publishers, on the other hand, whether they were republishing hardcover books or they were publishing paperback originals, which is pretty much all of what my dad's stuff was, um, they were selling so many books they didn't know how to get their head around it. I mean, in fact, the biggest challenge in the early days was managing inventory. Whether you print too many, did you ship out too many, and they just got lost and nobody knew where they went, or were you getting these big piles of things where you had to refund the return, and so the ebb and flow of material sent out and the material returned was tremendous. And in the early days, nobody had really good control over it. So the number of books that a writer sold, I would say up until maybe the mid 60s, was probably not so well documented as it is today. And the whole trick was to get control of your.
Even now I interview authors on my radio program, and they'll tell me what books influenced them when they were kids. And so many times your dad's name comes up. It just pops into their head.
That's great. Hey, when you're thinking about how many books he sold, probably the most important part is that my dad, from the beginning of his career until today, um, has never had a book go out of print.
Well, I would
So
say that's a pretty good testimony.
that's actually more impressive than the number, because there are writers out there who have sold uh, numbers of books very similar to my father, who've had all kinds of books go out of print. And so uh, his material is kind of the definition of an evergreen product. Um, and we're probably, I think pretty much certainly we're in the top 12, um, still in the top 12 best-selling authors in the Random House Group, which is the largest publishing company in the world.
Well,
So,
yeah,
like I said, I can't swear to an exact number, but I can tell you these other things have
and
a
that's
lot of meaning.
impressive. That's very impressive. That
Mhm.
they keep selling, and I know they do because people still read them and love them. And with this one, well, it must have been also. I'm sure you heard stories from him, like where he traveled when he was on these journeys, but to actually see it on paper and have to work it through your storyline, he really lived a very adventurous life. I mean, he went everywhere.
It's true, and it's also very interesting and kind of a wonderful personal experience when you get right down in the weeds of the words on a page, the words in a paragraph, and kind of experiencing the same problems that would have in expressing something, or looking at a particular time or a particular incident. And then anytime I work on something of my dad's, one of the things that I always try and do is bring more of his life into it than he did. So I've been studying his life very intimately for quite a while, and I try to find little elements. There are things that nobody would ever notice. There's a moment of description late in this book, um, where one of the main characters is just going to bed before he eventually goes to the ship and takes off on this on this ill-fated voyage, and there's a he's lying in bed in this little bungalow in the Hollywood Hills, and the lights of a car coming up the street kind of draw this pattern across the ceiling. They're kind of shining in the window, and because of the angle of the street, they're shining across the ceiling. It's like that's actually something I remember very well from when we lived in West Hollywood, and I would uh, be in my parents' room at night, and the cars would come up the street, and there would be this kind of interesting swirl of light across the ceiling as the headlights kind of came through the shutters, and as the car passed the house. So I try and pull as many elements from different eras of his life and different things of that sort and put them in there. And as you noticed, I'm sure reading this and reading the afterward, there are some strange things in this book. My dad sort of sort of predicted his adopted brother's death in this book. Um, I mean, the he
Yeah,
and it was written. I mean, it was written years. So his adopted brother had kind of vanished from the family, but my dad wrote the stuff about his adopted brother's death maybe 10 years before he actually died. And he had it kind of accurately. Maybe he just wrote a similar death in this story, and then when he heard that his brother Jack had died, he extrapolated those details onto it and told the story that way. I later found out that the story was a little bit different, but not terribly. And so there's some odd bits to it.
well, that brings us to one other book which I wanted to mention because this was a surprise for me. Thinking about things that seem unreal. Um,
Yeah,
Nobody knows. I don't think many people realize that he actually wrote a sci-fi book,
that's
and
right.
maybe there was some little bit woohoo going on in his in his mind. This is a fascinating book. I found it, and when I found this one, because I, we'll talk about your website after a little while because you have a great, absolutely fantastic website. But I think this book is so good. I love this book. Absolutely amazing. And to discover that he wrote a sci fi book. And I have one of his quotes there. I thought people would like that. Forever the dream is in the mind, realization is in the hands. Well, maybe something was in his mind when he wrote this. So, what did you think of this book, The Haunted Mesa?
Well, I was very involved in this book. I did a lot of the research for this book. So I was along with him for a lot of the research in Utah and Arizona doing this book. And then after a while, towards the end of his writing of this, he was just beginning to become unhealthy with what we discovered sometime later was lung cancer, but we didn't know it at the time. And so, because he wasn't doing so well, I actually went out and did a bunch of research on it. But the story of this actually backs up quite a bit, and it dovetails into some of the things we were talking about earlier. Before World War II, Dad wrote all kinds of all different genres, not science fiction, but adventure stories, crime stories. He wrote two westerns before World War II, but that was it. After World War II, he slowly did more and more Western short stories until the pulp magazines began to fail in the early 50s. And then he had to make the transition into writing paperback originals. Once he did, he became successful writing Westerns. And the publishers pretty much only wanted him to write Westerns. He wanted to make a name for himself and get back to the point where he could write in all different genres. And he struggled to do that, but he wrote maybe 12 or 15 quite successful westerns, and then he started trying to sell other things, and he had no luck. And he certainly could have written under a pseudonym. He certainly could have gone to other publishers. He certainly could have done various things like that. But his goal wasn't just to write other genres, he wanted to be successful in other genres. And so he kind of started trying to figure out, well, how can I make this work? Nobody wants to think of me as a multifaceted writer. And the first thing he did was he started trying to stretch the Western genre. And you would see that in books like Shalico, which is a very kind of European Western. It's about Europeans on safari in the West. You'd see Riley's Luck, which is a story that a Western, but then it travels around the world quite a bit. The Broken Gun, which is a contemporary Western, takes place in the 1950s, but it's about a mystery that occurred back in the days of the Old West. Um, and he kept trying to sort of turn the genre into something where he could have a little more fun with it. And he could kind of do some of the things that he had been doing back in the days when he could pretty much write anything he wanted. And eventually, as the American bicentennial came along, he started looking more and more at the early frontier. And so he wrote the early Sackett books that take place in the days of the earliest American colonies, and other stories of the early frontier, although not that quite that far back. And finally, he had kind of expanded his audience, and he had gotten his audience to accept the his doing various different things, and he had gotten his publisher to accept him doing various different things, that towards the end of his life he was able to publish The Haunted Mesa, which is science fiction, The Walking Drum, a historical novel, which incidentally was written in 1960, was written in that time period when he was first trying to break out. And he also was able to do Last of the Breed, Cold War thriller. And so he really, the end of his life was kind of capped off by his succeeding finally in being able to write in different genres and do the different things he wanted to do. Um, Haunted Mesa is interesting because it's science fiction, but it's kind of this weird West science fiction where it melds a little bit of Western mythology and Native American mythology with science fiction, various things like that. And so it's a very interesting story. He had a lot of trouble writing it. It was maybe the only book he ever really struggled with. But I think some of that was because he had very, very high, uh, very, very particular goals for it. And he wasn't maybe quite meeting those goals. And what he really needed to do is just relax and have fun writing a great adventure story. um, but fun book.
It is a fun book. And you mentioned that with this book you went out with him. At when did you start? Well, now did you do a lot of camping, going out into the wilds and things with him as a young man? How did
Yeah, when we did stuff like that, we didn't necessarily do an awful lot of camping, but pretty much every summer was spent. I wouldn't say it was like exactly doing research for a particular book, but it was kind of living in and visiting the sort of places that he wrote about, so that he always kind of stayed in contact with that world. I mean, we lived in Los Angeles, so we would get out of the city and do those sorts of things every summer. And then, eventually, by the time something like this story came along, I was already kind of working in the business. I was already working a little bit as an art director with covers of the books and stuff. I was already occasionally I'd go and find some of his old short stories that he didn't actually have at the Library of Congress. I was always doing a little bit of research work in one way or another to help out.
well, he first of all, he has such a wonderful smile. I love his smile. It just it's an amazing smile. It's a full, there's it's in his eyes as well as his lips. It's just he just has this wonderful, warm smile. And I was really thrilled to find this. And so I thought you should comment on this.
It's an interesting thing. My dad was very suspicious of Ronald Reagan when he first went into politics, and but they had kind of uh, a shared ethos in a lot of ways, and they got to be uh, uh, maybe more and more spiritually connected over the years. They didn't know each other. They weren't like buddies or anything like that, but I think they both appreciated uh, one another more and more as time went on.
Well, it seems appropriate, though, that if he's going to get a special medal, a congressional gold medal, that it would be given to him by Ronald Reagan, who looks so good on a horse.
Yeah, exactly.
I think this was on the South Lawn, and they were having a rodeo, a celebration. But that's a nice way to get an award.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I like that picture. I thought that was cute. Now, he won lots of awards, I think, too, right?
He won quite a few. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's I always feel like the awards are one thing, but uh, that never having a book go out of print and having a
that's
wonderful
the biggest.
fans that
That,
appreciate you, that's the real thing that matters.
exactly. And I have this photo. Is it Brown Derby?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like the Brown Derby.
Yeah.
So we did that quote. I thought that would be nice for, one of the things is so many of the people who watch and listen to my programs are people who want to write books and they dream about writing books, but they don't do it.
Dad was very much, get your butt in the chair and put words on paper and learn from, learn from yourself. It's like get stuff down and then try and figure out what it means to you. Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
start writing.
Yeah. And, he, I think one of his greatest qualities was writing in a manner that was accessible to young people, accessible to kids, accessible to people who didn't read much. Um, you see an awful lot of people learning to read English, um, getting back to the point where they are reading more in prison and places like this by reading Louis L'Amour. He's just a very, very accessible writer. And a lot of it was because he absolutely loved what he was doing. He loved every single minute of it. And you can feel it in the page as you read it. You can kind of feel the joy that he had for doing what he was doing, which is something that's not common amongst writers. I mean, it's a hard business, and luckily he had trained himself to write kind of almost directly from his unconscious, and so it did not have the kind of struggle for him that it did for other people. And I believe that that's really infectious, and it is. Louis is a great writer to start kids on. He's a great writer to start young men on, and I get letters all the time. Interestingly enough, from the two most common countries these days. Dad was translated into 27 languages back in the 20th century. Today, not so many, but so much more of the world reads English that it's a little hard to tell who's reading where. The two foreign countries I get a lot of fan mail from. When I say a lot, you have to take it in proportion, but um, India and Indonesia. Now, the Indonesia thing's a complete mystery to me. India makes sense because there's just an
Oh,
enormous
India
population.
India is a terrific market because they have 100 million people who read in English. They might
Yeah,
speak three different languages in India, but the reading is done in English. It's actually a terrific market for American writers, and very few of them have taken any time to investigate it because when you have 100 million people who only read their books in English, That's a big market.
It's huge, and they also have, I mean, all you need to do is look at their films, and
Exactly.
there is a great similarity between the way Dad wrote. I mean, their movies are entertaining and joyous, and uh, they move quickly and they have fun, and I think there's a distinct similarity there.
Well, as a matter of fact, now I have to say this is really a thrill for me. You've used in two paragraphs. You use the word joy, and then you use the word joyous, which which is really great because and I do resent one thing. These are not books just for boys. Oh my goodness. I was reading them, as I said, when I was 5 years old. I started reading them. And I remember we had this table in the corner, and those books, when you say, oh, 300 million books, it's not how many people read them. More read them because those books were read by for years. You know, those books would always be there. There is something in his writing that is really filled with, I think it's optimism. It's the
Yes,
optimism. He makes you
absolutely.
feel, you read his books and you feel, yeah, feel good and it's just something about it. And that's why he's lasted so long, and he is never going to go out of style because people need that kind of reading.
It's true. And you have to forgive me. I mentioned boys a few times because so much of the publishing industry today is completely and totally organized around women.
I
I
know.
would say a slight majority of our readers are women.
These books are great for guys, great for women. Everybody should read them. They are wonderful, and I think you've done a just a fantastic job. Let's talk a little bit about what you're doing to preserve everything, because you have a major website and it's really great. And tell us what people can find there, because I know they can find videos and they can find more about the books. And
Oh gosh. Okay. So the easiest way into the whole collection of websites is Louis L'Amour, Louis Lamour, no capitals, no apostrophe.
is that pretty cool? That leads us down the trail to your website, louislamour.com.
The other thing that's worth mentioning, and No Traveler Returns is a big element of this, is this new series of books and reprints of old books we have called Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures. And so the Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures books, some of them are my dad's books that have been published for a very long time. They now have a kind of a bonus features postscript in them that is the story behind the story. And so in that, there's about 30 of them like that. And in that postscript, I kind of go in and talk about what the book was trying to do in my dad's career, what sort of things he was doing at the moment that he wrote it, what its influences were. Um, there's sometimes there's the story of a movie that was made from the book. Sometimes there's a story of how the story developed, and I'll have different early drafts of it. Um, the There are two books of unfinished works called Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures, Volumes 1 and Volume 2. This is in addition to the postscripts in all the other books. And in that, I take stories that I have a fair amount of information on, and I'll take those and put in, like, he wrote several different drafts trying to get the story started, changing different things, or there are sets of notes explaining where the story is going or what it led to. Sometimes correspondence, things like this. It's sort of the Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures series. The whole thing is like a slightly random access professional biography of my dad. It goes through what he was writing and why and how in for many of these different titles.
Well, it's a great website. Lots of wonderful things to discover there. You have video there. You have more information about him. And I think your dad would be so proud of you. You've done a beautiful job to keep all of this together and really bring it out to the public in such a wonderful way.
I keep trying.
Well, you're doing a great job, and I really it's an honor to talk to you. I just I'm getting such a kick out of this. It's really an honor to talk to you.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you, Beau L'Amour. You've done a great job. Your dad would be proud of you, and everybody who goes to your website will be impressed with the work that you've done to preserve his memory because he was a great guy.
Thank you.
Okay, bye bye now. Bye.
Goodbye.
Well, it was such an honor to talk to Beau L'Amour. It was really great. I, you know, it's like a dream come true. I would never have thought when I was a little girl that someday I would be talking to the son of this great author. So I hope you'll get the books. Go to this website. It is fascinating. There are so many things to learn about Louis L'Amour. And again, please subscribe to Joy on Paper Live so that I can bring you more interviews with fascinating authors and the fascinating stories behind the books. And I have a lot of authors lined up, but I need support. So please subscribe, and you know what to do. Like, share, and comment, because that's what we have to do here on YouTube. And I want to thank YouTube too for doing this. This is a wonderful service. People really can get an opportunity to learn so many things. So thank you. Please just subscribe right now. Just push that button, and you can find some more interesting and fascinating stories here at Joy on Paper Live.
Turn the house down.
Thank you.